Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. A very warm welcome to the third webinar in our Agrarian Conversations series. This webinar is entitled Populism, Authoritarianism, and Agrarian Struggles. And today we will showcase and launch a number of recent, relevant, and urgent publications, discuss recent events, and assess the struggles in and from rural areas in relation to right-wing populism. This webinar will be mainly in English with interpretation to French and Spanish. One speaker will also speak in Portuguese with interpretation to French, Spanish, and English. Please, can you see the instructions on your screen and in the chat for accessing translation? And don't hesitate to ask in the chat if you have any questions. My name is Ruth Hall. I'm at class at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. And a quick word to introduce the Agrarian Conversations webinar series. What makes this seminar series special is firstly, it brings together scholar activists, activist scholars, and others to build our global community. Our idea is that we are trying to reverse some hierarchies and continue to struggle against the old hierarchies, specifically by foregrounding the voices of scholar activists in and from the global South, and putting the insights and experiences of women and younger scholar activists at the center. So the webinar series is about opening up dialogues to make sense of what's going on in our world. And this is why we've provided some background reading for each webinar, and you can see a link in the chat to the background reading, including a whole book for free download, which is open access. So we're not going to have long lectures, but short and sharp inputs. Also, this series of webinars, Agrarian Conversations, is unapologetically political in our purpose and our outlook. Our concern here is what is going on in rural worlds and what this means for agrarian struggles. These conversations are organized by a range of scholar activist networks and organizations. And this is a collective initiative of the Journal of Peasant Studies, CASAS, PLAS, ICAS, YARA, ERPI, PASTRES, Russia's, and the Transnational Institute. That's a lot. Today's conversation has its roots 5 years ago in the aftermath of Trump and Brexit, Bolsonaro and Modi, Duterte and Erdogan. Among our agrarian networks, an urgent response was launched in response to this rise of the right wing and the ways in which it was making itself present in rural societies. To make sense of this attack on progressive politics, several of us launched an Emancipatory Rural Politics Initiative, ERPI. We set up a small grants program across many countries and convened a major conference in the Netherlands in March 2018. Since then, there's been a range of efforts around the world to make sense of and build the pushback in rural areas, including by discussing the emancipatory potential of left-wing populism. Since then, there have been initiatives in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in North America that have aimed to deepen this activist intellectual pushback against reactionary forces. We're also delighted today to launch this week the Agrarian Conversations website. The Agrarian Conversations website, the link will be in the chat now. This website will be the place where we have an ecosystem of resources, information on these webinars, articles from the Journal of Peasant Studies, videos, blogs, an agrarian politics podcast, and all kinds of news and resources that we can share as we gather momentum as a community. So please do expect many more updates and accessible materials for scholar activists to come your way. Please keep an eye on that website and share it far and wide. For now, I will hand over to Katie, my co-chair from TNI, to introduce the speakers and let you know about the format for today.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thanks to everyone, to our speakers, and to all of you in the audience for joining this conversation today. We're really glad to have you with us. We're going to start the conversation today with just a brief introduction from each of the four speakers, who will share some of their perspectives on recent developments linked to populism, authoritarianism, and the rural world in the very different contexts in which they're working. Following those interventions, we're going to ask three members of our networks to also share brief updates from different regional initiatives that should give an idea of some of the overview of very different dynamics and activities going on around the world in relation to these issues. After those presentations and the updates, we're going to move on to an interactive Q&A. So you should see at the bottom of your screen now a box for Q&A. And we'd invite you to share your questions throughout the webinar in that box, and we will organize and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the discussion. We'd invite you also to use the chat box, which you can find on the right-hand side. And you can use that to share observations with other members of the audience and to discuss and share resources and information of any kind. We'll be sharing as well resources, links, and further reading throughout the webinar. So do check out that as well. And finally, if you're on Twitter or on other social media, we're using the hashtags #Agrarian Conversations and #Authoritarian Populism today. So feel free to share your thoughts and your reflections there with us and with the wider world. So with all of that said, I would like to hand over to the people you've come to listen to our great set of speakers. Our first speaker will be Achin van Eyck. Achin is a retired professor of international relations and global politics and the former head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. Among many other things, you can see some on your screen, Achin has been a fellow of the Transnational Institute since 1987. Thank you so much for joining us, Achin. Without further ado, I will hand over to you to tell us in about 10 minutes about some of the recent and evolving dynamics of authoritarian populism as you've been exploring in your work.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. And I'd like to start by highlighting certain insights from a book, Authoritarian Populism and the Rural World. Within the covers of the single book, you have a remarkable comparative study of authoritarian populism in different countries and its relationship, origins, and consequences with their respective rural hinterlands, which include smaller towns and where people beyond just the peasantry reside and work. In this compilation, most unusual and welcome, is a penultimate chapter that evaluates the strengths and limits of the different contributions. But most importantly, it reminds us that the rural is not just the agrarian or peasant domain, but that there is a wider rural and semi-urban network of social relations around property and labor that must be brought in if we are to understand the linkages and the resistances to authoritarian populist organizations and movements. The very fact of being a comparative study makes it possible to identify core features of authoritarian populism beyond the particular institutional or ideological form it takes in any country. The crucial common factor that lies behind the emergence of authoritarian populism everywhere is the political economy of neoliberal capitalist globalization, whose material impact includes rising inequalities of income and wealth, stagnant or declining incomes and more deaths for the majority, jobless growth, greater corporatization of agriculture, more extractivism, and newer and more insecure patterns of migration, domestic and external. Many of the contributions in the book have highlighted the rise of negative forms of identity politics as being central to the mobilizing practices of authoritarian populisms. A major factor behind this is precisely the globalizing dimension of this neoliberal economic paradigm. For most people, globalization has rendered the much narrower time-space coordinates of their lived experience, incapable of comprehending, let alone hoping to control the vast array of forces that now shape and constrain their lives. Faced with such deep uncertainty and psychic disorientation, many cling to identities seemingly unchangeable and permanent, namely those ascribed from birth of ethnicity, race, and religion. But even these loyalties are invariably encased within a nationalist framework of us, the real people, the true nationals, against them, the scapegoated other, whether internal or external. After all, in the world we live in, different peoples are constituted as belonging to separate nation states. That is to say, all authoritarian populisms are also authoritarian nationalisms. This is implicitly understood and accepted throughout the book, but it is not positioned up front, which is what I would like to do, and to discuss the implications of this reality. The political economy of neoliberal capitalism represents a strongly right-wing shift in the pattern of capitalist accumulation and development from that of the past. But this transnational process is taking place in a world of multiple nation states, and therefore can only be stabilized by nationally specific forms of right-wing politics and ideology, which necessarily erode the substantive content of democracy, even in countries claiming to be stable liberal democracies, USA, India, so on. Also, as pointed out by the editors and others, all populisms, left or right, are multi-class formations assembling different and contradictory class and group interests. Left-wing populism is more class-oriented and pursues genuine progressive socio-economic and political reforms in favor of the more oppressed and exploited sections of society. Right-wing populism, for mobilizing purposes, will seek to capitalize on the negative effects of neoliberalism and may even demand a few compensatory welfare measures, but will never challenge the class-based foundations of the neoliberal order itself. Indeed, they seek to achieve a longer-lasting hegemony within this neoliberal framework. For them to succeed here requires three things. They have to win over significant sections of the ruling class, not that difficult. They have to consolidate and expand middle-class support. But how to secure and sustain support from below amidst conflicts of material interest between those below and above? Using carrots and sticks for those at the bottom is part of the answer. But clearly, these tensions must somehow be masked by an ideological discourse that can also aim to maximally unify the populace against the stipulated minority outside. Only then can hegemony, or what Gramsci called the national popular will, be secured. Why the emphasis on the national? Other large-scale collective identities of ethnicity, race, religion are imagined communities that express forms of belonging that do have a cultural, emotional appeal that right-wing populist leaders try their best to manipulate to their advantage. But the nation, as Ben Anderson has pointed out, is by its very nature an imagined political community. And it is this political dimension that gives it exceptional power and means that culturally exclusivist politics founded on ethnicity, race, or religion must, if they are to be successful, co-opt and conjoin with the nation. The national identity is political in two ways, vertically and horizontally. The nation state remains the single most important political unit, witness what's happening to the EU, because it is a modern construct where the state is said to belong to a particular people designated as its citizens. That is to say, the state is formally accountable to and formally for the benefit of the citizens. Even dictatorships declare that the state is for the people and not the patrimony of the ruling clique, family, class, or even the constitutionally sanctioned monarch. This is the vertical dimension. Furthermore, the notion of citizen and some collectively shared rights, not subjecthood, as in the past, carries with it a new principle of horizontal equality that, despite uneven social status and power, does provide a newer and more meaningful sense of dignity and self-worth. What does this mean for the pursuit of a more emancipatory politics that can involve rural agency? We recognize that our problems are such that they must ultimately be resolved at the international level. Right-wing populisms are striving to forge cross-country links, and of course, we, the progressives and other progressive movements, must try and do the same. But the route to achieving a progressive internationalism cannot avoid going through the struggles for a progressive nationalism. Indeed, in this project of emancipation, this book provides a pointer to where we should head. Right-wing populisms are greater in number and in geographical spread than left-wing populisms, which have also tended to fade over time. Nevertheless, the insights provided by some of the studies of such left-wing efforts are very important. Yes, our longer-term ambition must be the defeat of this neoliberal order, and in my view, its replacement by an anti-capitalist, deeply democratic socialist order. But even among those who would disagree with me on this ultimate goal, there can be agreement on what to push for now, namely the development of mass political support for raising and implementing a program of left social democratic reforms at all levels, economic, social, political, cultural, and this effort must cover and unite the rural and the urban. Where agriculture and its backward-forward linkages have not yet been corporatized, its proponents must be opposed. Here, the remarkable struggle waged by the Indian farmers is an object lesson and inspiration. But this was a successful defensive struggle, preventing for some time what should not be done. A more offensive strategy requires promoting agroecological practices based on smallholders with active encouragement and expansion of cooperative forms of farming and agro-processing that can provide jobs for the rural landless and other workers. Food sovereignty is another goal, while reliance on extractivism, as in Latin America, must be limited temporarily and spatially. Such local efforts at achieving greater autonomy in rural and semi-urban areas must be conjoined with other urban-based and national-level progressive groups and movements struggling to promote human and civic rights, environmental concerns, housing and healthcare, deeper democratization through institutionalized devolution of popular power, participatory budgeting as well, the best of it, as well as struggles waged by feminists and other oppressed minorities. The way forward is difficult and full of uncertainties, but the editors and contributors to this book have given us some sense of what direction we should take. This is something to be thankful for.
Thank you very much, Achin. Thank you for that very deep and comprehensive introduction to some of the big issues that we're putting on the table here today. I would like to invite everyone. I see we already have a few great questions coming in through the Q&A. I would like to invite people to continue adding your questions throughout, and we will direct these to all of the speakers at the end of the session. So put them now before you forget. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Ramona Dominiocioiu. Sorry, Ramona. Ramona is joining us from Romania in place of her colleague Attila, who had to step out due to a family emergency. So thank you very much, Ramona, for stepping in and joining us here today. Ramona is a peasant from Ionesti village in Romania in Eastern Europe. She's part of the coordination committee of Eco-Ruralis, the Association of Peasants from Romania. And she'll be speaking today about the experiences with authoritarian populism and resistance to it in Eastern Europe. Please go ahead, Ramona.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with all of you today, to listen to you, to learn from you, to share what we have to say. I personally come from a long line of peasant generations from the south of Romania, as do over 4 million of peasants like me in my country. The rural population in my country represents 46% of the people who live here. In general, Eastern Europe, where I come from, has a particular experience with authoritarian regimes, as we experienced both dominant political systems, living through the communism controlled by Russia and the Soviet Union, and now the capitalism controlled by Western European countries, the USA, financial institutions, and the ultra-rich private corporations that are emerging as a power that plays by its own rules. My organization, Eco Ruralis, is a member of Via Campesina. In Europe, we are organized as a European coordination Via Campesina. The ideology of Via Campesina can be described as progressive left, adapted region by region to the realities, the history, and the culture of peasants. The movement of peasants of La Via Campesina is building food sovereignty, which is a vision of how we need to build justice in farming and in food systems, starting from who takes decisions on what we produce, how we produce, for whom we produce, who benefits, while prioritizing the most vulnerable and those who work the hardest, the peasants. Food sovereignty is essentially a human right, as La Via Campesina defines it as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and our right to define our own food and agriculture systems. Via Campesina took this vision forward and worked very hard for about 2 decades to have negotiated and approved at the United Nations level an UN declaration for the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas, a declaration that defines our human rights as rural people, and food sovereignty is one of them. This is one of the most progressive documents that was adopted by the UN General Assembly, so by the UN at the highest level, before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us, and before things started to go, let's face it, to go a bit crazy. I want to share with you thoughts from our region regarding our agrarian struggles that are navigating this pandemic crisis, which enhance populism and authoritarianism. The first and most visible impact for us was the restriction of access to markets that were leading to local markets shutdowns. The opposition of the peasants and the workers was met with police violence, and in some cases was met with political ignorance. In the same time, governments were applying double standards, offering unconditional support for supermarkets, which were maintained open during even the most restrictive times. Our governments, most of them coming from the center of the political spectrum, proved to be completely unable and weak, unable to protect the local markets and the public food systems in times of crisis. Another concrete and painful consequence aggravated by the COVID crisis is the degradation of the rights, of the human rights and the work conditions of migrant and seasonal agricultural workers who have been and continue to be exposed in the first line of the pandemic. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and in Europe, the process was facilitated through diplomatic channels, pressuring Eastern European and other poorer countries to provide migrant labor to agro-businesses in Western European countries, creating cross-border corridors that disrespected the public health measures. The Western European agriculture, which absorbs the majority of the common agriculture policy funds, continues to be based on seasonal migrant labor exploitation, which degrades the human rights and maintains poverty in Eastern Europe and in North Africa, from where the majority of these workers come. The peasants and the rural people were among the first ones to suffer from the lack of solidarity at international level between governments, which is leading to more geopolitical inequalities, rich versus poor, particularly in our region, East versus West, and EU versus non-EU member states. Another worrying effect of the COVID crisis is the deepening of the poverty and social inequality due to job losses, market restrictions, marginalization of the rural areas in public fund distribution as a response to COVID-19 crisis, because most of the public funding was distributed towards urban areas, ignoring rural areas. As the crisis continues, it's really unknown how far the poverty and social inequalities will go, and how much the consequences will extend into the society. And this phenomenon is definitely feeding the continuous rise of the extreme right. There is a very strong social division that cannot be ignored, generated by the COVID-19 restriction measures due to inconsistent and contradictory communication of the governments, which have a very difficult time managing the crisis. The dialogue between the rural people and decision makers became more limited than ever. We were not in a good position before the crisis, but now we're really in a worse position. The continuous state of alert imposed by governments made them discover new power and grasp on them, clinch on them, and has the potential to lead to the degradation of the entire democratic process. In the same time, we're experiencing the alarming acceleration of the corporate agenda on digitalization, ultra-technologization, and international trade that seem to be presented as the only solution to overcome the crisis. These fake solutions are said to leave rural areas and small-scale food producers behind. Nowadays, all public strategies speak about digitalization, and so much public funding is directed towards this. In this digitalization frenzy, there is no consistent debate on the ownership of the big data and what social consequences can digitalization have, as for example, the digitalization of genetic information for food and agriculture that leads to patents and that infringe on peasants' and farmers' rights to seeds, which are the basis of food production. Finally, in terms of effects of COVID crisis, peasants suffer from the negative role played by financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and so on. The financial institutions pushed for privatization of natural resources in exchange for loans to help governments respond to the COVID crisis. And the clear example in Europe is Ukraine. In the early stages of the pandemics, in the spring of 2020, Ukraine was forced by the IMF to liberalize over 20 million hectares of agricultural land, despite public protest, which was difficult to organize at the time, in order to receive funds, a loan to support the public health system. I want to go back to food sovereignty and speak a little bit about the wrongful appropriation of food sovereignty. It's simple to understand food sovereignty and human rights, but it's really complicated to apply it, especially in these times. Political groups from all political spectrum, from extreme right to extreme left and everything in between, understand that food sovereignty is a powerful and a very innovative concept that speaks to the people. And they use it as a populist tool to build political power. Some are more successful than others. The extreme right, for sure, is the loudest, and they receive a special attention by the media, which helps. They were already on the rise before the pandemic, and in the past 2 years, the entire crazy context served them very well. But also in the center part of the political spectrum, they also dive into populist topics, hypocritically claiming that we need to protect national food producers, national interests, while they continue to serve business as usual, international trade, new technologies that are inaccessible for the poor, and in fact that aim to make the poor poorer and eliminate peasants from agriculture. As you can imagine, it's really complicated to build a progressive leftist peasant movement in any former Soviet country, as we go through a pandemic that feeds confusion, hysteria, and social division. In Eastern Europe, the extreme right is expanding its power in countries like Romania, Hungary, Poland, Belarus, and other countries. And as we stand here today, the conflict on the eve of war between Ukraine and Russia threatens the entire region with very complex implications, but certainly a conflict that has the rural people at the forefront, voiceless and completely vulnerable. As we've been talking a lot in the past weeks with our brothers and sisters from Ukraine and from Republic of Moldova that are very exposed to this potential war, to the conflict, we have a message for you. We need to remain calm and focus on the unity and on the people. And as they say, if we have an open and inclusive attitude, if we take the time to understand each other's differences, we can overcome the problems from agriculture and the problems of security that are building. In conclusion, I just want to say that the situation is not simple. It's very complex. When we analyze the rural areas, if we paint an image where rural people are captive to populism and victims of authoritarianisms, victims that are feeding off of the political hands that managed best to manipulate us, well, it's wrong and it's incomplete, it's superficial. We really need to go deeper than that. We need consistent and more work, more profound work to support and support from academics, from scholars, especially from the region, from Eastern Europe, who take the appropriate time to understand the context in which we're living and the context in which we work, what tools we have and what tools we're developing, what is the pace of development of our process. There is a lot of nuance in the rise of populism that leads to authoritarianisms, and if we simplify the reality, we need to polarize, we tend to polarize the society, and we have been doing this for too long. So it's time to change a little bit the perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramona, for those rich reflections and for unpacking some of this huge complexity, including how the situation is still changing between the situation in Ukraine and the still evolving COVID pandemic. So thank you very much for bringing those perspectives. I would like to hand over, or well, to introduce and to hand over as well to our next speaker, Garrett Lovelace Grady. Garrett was born and raised in a farming community in Kentucky and now researches and teaches agricultural policy, agrarian politics, and decoloniality as an associate professor at the American University School of International Service. Among many other projects, Garrett recently co-edited the Emancipatory Politics and Authoritarian Populism in the Rural United States, special feature in the Journal of Rural Studies. Before I hand over, I would like to remind us all, and as always, especially myself, to please try to speak slowly for the sake of our interpreters. Thank you very much. Garrett, please go ahead.
Greetings, good people. I am so honored to be sharing real-time and virtual space with extraordinary activists and analysts of the intense moment that we're in globally. My name is Garrett Grady Lovelace, and I'm calling in right now from DC, Piscataway lands, DC, the belly of the beast, Piscataway lands, a space of indigenous sovereignty. So today we'll be talking about what's happening in the North American context. In the wake of the disastrous 2016 US presidential election, media, scholars, pop culture, and liberal policymakers blamed the rural as monolithically racist. This reductive reaction was weak analytically and politically, as Ramona and Professor Ashin just mentioned, and as the Emancipatory Rural Politics Initiative sought to show. So Antonio Roman Alcala, a colleague and friend, and Mark Edelman, another colleague and friend, and I convened a special feature for Journal of Rural Studies that gathered place-based research and critical analysis to demonstrate and contextualize how rural regions across North America, Abya Yala, in all of their vast diversity, have been struggling with numerous common interrelated problems that have been convoluted and co-opted, thereby tragically feeding the beast of authoritarianism. So you can see here the array of articles, and I'll drop the links in the chat box. You can have access to the PDFs. There's a lot of wonderful research going in these. The issues described and analyzed in these compilations, however, persist and have gotten even worse in the years since. In lieu of stable or dignified livelihoods, rural residents across the US and Mexico and Canada work increasingly in temporary, precarious gigs for corporate powerhouses that pay little to no taxes. Deregulated from adequate labor or environmental safeguards, these mega corporations dominate sectors, dominate markets, and dominate governments largely unchecked. The people working the most dangerous jobs on farms or in meatpacking factories are often undocumented and risk daily racist deportation raids. even those seemingly independent operators like poultry farmers or right now truckers operate through exploitative contracts with corporate buyers and face grinding downward pressure on prices. Meanwhile, the cost of living is rising precipitously across these countries, so the basics are becoming prohibitively expensive. With no ample tax base, rural areas suffer underfunded schools and widespread closures of hospitals. Even 2 years into a pandemic, the US has failed to offer universal or even affordable or accessible healthcare. Meanwhile, opioid deaths have risen dramatically. I go to many totally depressing virtual funerals of friends and family in my community in Middle America. So meanwhile, all the while, these rural communities are suffering climate crises of apocalyptic scale, raging wildfires, vast floods, tornado clusters, just like the one that happened in Kentucky, multi-year droughts, overnight hurricanes, all exacerbating the existing vulnerabilities of housing, health, and food insecurity. Meanwhile, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American, and immigrant communities in rural areas face these crises on top of long festering racism, which has erupted recently into blatant white supremacist backlash. After the 2020 police reform bids have failing, state-sanctioned racist brutality has continued. In the agricultural sector, very important legislation, the Justice for Black Farmers and the Emergency Debt Relief for BIPOC farmers have stalled due to racist injunctions. This intersects with an aggravated misogyny, a full legal and judicial assault on reproductive rights. Reproductive care has been hypercriminalized, with laws paying thousands of dollars for telling on anyone helping a woman seeking abortion, and rural communities and women and gender diverse communities are bearing the brunt of this. The disaster embodies the twisted logic at work here. In the name of liberty, fundamental liberties are robbed. In the name of having, small government, there's extreme government overreach into bodily sovereignty, which relates to food sovereignty, as Via Campesina has so brilliantly put forth for years. Nevertheless, social, gender, racial justice movements have bravely risen up and are reaching out. In Mexico, the López Obrador administration has launched promising agroecology politics to ban GM corn imports and glyphosate. And then there's the Sembrando Vida program, a rural basic income in exchange for agroforestry planting. But neoliberal status quo remains, other toxins, agrotoxins abound, and corporate monopolies abound. And meanwhile, rural outmigration from Central America and Mexico continue to grow because of neoliberalism and the militarized drug war. The 2020 presidential election was a close call with outright authoritarianism in the US. There was an attempted coup right thereafter. And the Biden administration has been a relief, but also completely problematic. We still have mass world spending, a historic rise in world spending in war and deadly military weapons, in lieu of actually spending on social services. There was a whole movement for defunding and abolishing the police, but right now you have a backlash and actually a re-entrenching of the police in the carceral state, and the prison industrial and military and industrial complexes remain with a stranglehold on government. Nevertheless, there are bright spots.
Just to ask you to go a tiny bit slower, sorry to interrupt.
Sure, yes. And so I'll end on some bright spots. The rise of organized labor, this is happening. Even in the US with the complete kind of corporate monopoly on so many of our institutions. So there's organizing for unions and there's organizing for collective bargaining. And meanwhile, a heroic rise of indigenous sovereignty movements exemplified by the land back movement. So my own work, I've been honored to work with the Via Campesina chapters in the US with community-led action research. This has meant collaborating and learning from elders and movement leaders of the Rural Coalition, the National Family Farm Coalition, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, and all of their diverse members and allies. Building off of that special issue that we did for Journal of Rural Studies, particularly this idea of agrarian crisis as being the fodder for this authoritarian co-optation, and this article on the 2 hidden histories of rural racial solidarity movements in the wake of the 1980s farm crisis, and I'll drop the link for those articles, a project has emerged to update parity, which was the US set of policies for a fair price for farmers and a supply management. That set of policies largely only benefited white and male farmers, but it existed as an honest recognition of the ravages of agrocapitalism unfettered, and thereby serves as an important precedent. So how could we update fair prices and supply management for racial and gender equity among farmers and for agroecology? This has brought together a range of organizations, and I think in the audience, a few representatives. And now we have a website, disparitytobarity.org, with leaders of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives talking about land justice as it relates to parity, as well as leaders of the farm justice movement, thinking through agroecological adaptations of parity. We've had a year-long webinar series with such leaders and icons as Dolores Huerta, thinking through the labor implications. Farm workers are just farmers without land in the North American context. So this issue of agrarian viability is at the heart of what's pushing migrants across the border in such deadly risks. And so we're thinking about, could parity, pricing, and supply management be a game changer for a new generation of BIPOC farmers, laying the groundwork for agroecology and food sovereignty? In the middle of this project, the largest peaceful protest in human recorded history emerged about minimum support price. So we've expanded the project to disparity, to parity, to solidarity, affirming that tens of millions of Indian farmers are right. So much does depend on a fair farm gate price and secure market for agrarian viability and to stave off agro-corporate capture. So we've been partnering with some of the leaders and the analysts of the Indian farmer revolution, thinking through, is this a tipping point for international agricultural policy at large? Meanwhile, I'll end with another project that I think is heartening amidst this broader landscape of authoritarianism in rural areas, and that has to do with seed sovereignty. So right before the pandemic, we organized a gathering in Appalachia of radical seed savers and the booming seed sovereignty networks and movements, and we analyzed the role of big data and digitization and data sovereignty as it relates to seed and food sovereignty. The shared analysis in Encuentro asked, under what conditions does agrobiodiversity nourish communities, and how can it be allowed to flourish? This led to Ira Wallace and other amazing leaders, Karen Washington and Aaliyah Fraser, helping us think through the findings. We brought those findings to Yucatan in Spanish right before the pandemic and asked the same question and brought together some of the leaders of the Milpa, the Mayan Milpa resurgence movement, to think through how we could support agrobiodiversity as a foundation for food sovereignty and agroecology to stave off authoritarianism in rural areas. We published these findings in Mayan and in Spanish and are now working with Peruvian farmers and networks to think through the same questions in the Andean context. We're gathering these findings in an open access multilingual special feature. Agrobiodiversity nourishes us, la agrobiodiversidad nos nutre, action research for agroecological transformations. I'll drop the link if you have any videos about this work. We're gathering these instances to show that even though there's a dire authoritarianism looming on the landscape, there's extraordinary grassroots, peasant-led, campesina-led movements to counter it. Thank you.
Katie, not sure if I should jump in here. We're co-chairing this. Thank you so much, Garrett. Very powerful. And thanks also for sharing all of those very important resources. Our final speaker in this main section will be Ayala Ferreira, who is from La Via Campesina, and the MST, the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra, apologies, in Brazil. She will be speaking in Portuguese, but thank you to our interpreters who will be switching. We would also love you to be able to follow the movement of the MST and La Via Campesina in the links that are being posted now. So over to you, Ayala. Thank you very much for joining us.
Bom dia, desde o Brasil a todos.
Hello, welcome from Brazil to everyone. Let me just turn this off here. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for inviting me from the landless movement, the MST. First of all, I'd like to start by sharing a bit of a poem. This says a lot about what we hope for in such difficult times as the current ones. We will continue, comrades. There's no such thing as fear. The correct destination is the road we're on. We'll grow together. We are going to share the land and the sea, comrades, the bread of life, my hug, my embrace, my breast that was made to love. So I've just got 10 minutes to share a few ideas on this vital issue. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. So I'd like to say where I'm coming from. I am coming out of our experience. I'm from the landless movement, the MST. It's 38 years old. It came out of the fight for the democratization of access to land, so peasants could have access to the land, and also the fight for agrarian reform. This is still just a dream in our country. We fight for social transformation to overcome inequality and concentration of wealth. As we've seen, that's the basis of the capitalist system. Over these 38 years, we've been organizing settlements and camps with many thousands of families of workers and peasants. I live in a region that's in the Brazilian Amazon, in the north of Brazil. So that's away from the urban centers in our country. This region is marked by a high level of biodiversity. Now that's important for Brazil, but for the whole world as well. It's important for the balance of the ecosystem of the entire world. Sadly, it's also suffered attacks from private interests, the interest of capital. Biodiversity is being processed by big companies and for roads and hydroelectric projects and so on. So mineral extraction projects are being supported at the moment. Also big monocultures for cereals or certain trees, and also livestock farming. So sadly, in my region, what we're seeing is this. Land defenders and defenders of biodiversity, environmentalists, and so on, and peasants, indigenous people, people from Colombo communities, are now suffering. Every day, they suffer violence. Sadly, in this region, we see the highest number of murders of defenders of forests and land and biodiversity. So that's the context I'm speaking from. Now, I'm proud to say that this land suffers pain, but it's also a ground of resistance. Thanks to this resistance, I am in an agrarian reform community in an area where there's a big struggle for land. And it's made things possible for people like me. We are able to reproduce our community. I'm going to use my 10 minutes, and then there's some space for debate, for other thoughts. I thought I might be able to speak a bit longer, so maybe my speech is a little long. In any case, it's important to say this. I've got 4 main elements, 3 analysis, 1 challenge. So I'll talk about the analysis. First of all, I live in a country that carries a burden from history. Our reality is one in which the three key issues. Concentration of land. Sadly, that's got the highest level of concentration in the world. Legitimizing of slave labor by indigenous people and black people. This is structural racism. People have been murdered, and black people, Afro-descendant people are still being killed today. In this country, we have anti-popular governments, to use that term. In over 500 years of colonization of our country, poor people have been trying to affect power, but they've always been repressed. So this is a historical burden of capitalism dependent on colonialism. And this is a daily struggle still. And peasants are at the heart of this dispute. So I wanted to say this. The resistance projects in Brazil have certain characteristics. It's got culture, color, and specific forms. There's indigenous, black, and popular resistance. These involve people who haven't been included in the logic of capitalism and that dependency that we see here. So when we talk about resistance, we're talking about people who live from the land, from the forests, or in peripheral areas close to the projects of capitalism. So in these 10 minutes, I'd like to talk about certain important thoughts that are relevant today. At the moment, we are witnessing a deep crisis of capitalism. It's not just an old crisis, it's structural. It relates to the form of organizing in the system. So we can see this economically, deepening inequality socially, limits of democracy in bourgeois sense, the actions of the state, attacks on peoples, and this the issue of values of civilization and community. So in some ways, this crisis that's based on barbarism and hate and violence and war, and that's what's coming out of it. We see direct war and hybrid wars as well. It's an environmental crisis also. And that has made it worse. There's a daily aggression and violence that we see coming out of capitalism against nature. Commons are being privatized. People are taking control of mineral resources, forests, biodiversity, and turning it all into merchandise, into goods for sale. That's the logic behind all this. So unfortunately, this brings up contradictions. The environmental crisis is helping to promote pandemics. What we face around the world is really related to the way capital organizes. It's untrammeled, it's crazy. People just think about merchandise, commodities. Nature and people need time to reorganize and reproduce. So I'll just finish with those thoughts. And we are experiencing a crisis today, economically, socially, environmentally. So rather than facing the causes of the crisis, what we've done is deepen these causes. So nature is being destroyed more quickly. Everything must be made into a product. The burden's being put on the shoulders of the workers. They're being put in a more precarious situation through reforms, So the levels of oppression are going up. People are living in a more precarious way as well. So this logic is being imposed. It doesn't respect other ways of life that don't focus on capital. So it's a moment of polarization, different plans, different ways of life. Unfortunately, established capitalism are better positioned than we are in the resistance. We need to propose an alternative. So some people say we need to reconcile private interests with a minimum level of distribution to ensure living standards. We know this is not correct. There are rival plans here. At this time of crisis, we need to think about projects that go beyond the logic of capitalism. So I'm going to finish now, and then during the debate, we can talk about the MST experiences. We have been looking at active resistance in this time of COVID, the different forms of active resistance that we've been carrying out. Thank you very much once more for this chance to speak. Sorry if I've gone over time. I'll pass the floor back.
Thank you so much, Ayala. We're very grateful to you for joining us. I apologize, I didn't have your bio with me as you started. So thank you to all of our speakers. Already the chat box is very lively. I'd like to encourage everyone to share comments and your responses, as well as questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. And we are trying to group these together and we'll then share them with our panelists for an open discussion shortly. In the meantime, and while you are putting down your comments and questions, I would like to invite 3 members of the Emancipatory Rural Politics Initiative to very briefly introduce themselves. And what they're going to do is to give a 1 to 2 minute update on their regional work in different parts of the world that they've been busy with over the past few years. First of all, we will have Natalia Mamanova. Each of them will actually introduce themselves very briefly as they give us the updates. Natalia, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm an affiliated researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and I'm the coordinator of the European Regional Initiative. And let me start directly with our major output, which is a journal special issue on right-wing populism in rural Europe that was published in Sociologia Ruralis in 2020. And you will see on the chart the link to it. And the special issue included articles on Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, United Kingdom, Italy, Sweden, Basque Country, and the guest editor's overview. And currently the articles are in open access for a short period of time, so hurry up to read them. And let me...
Natalia,
yes.
Even though you've got only a couple of minutes, can you go a bit slower?
Sure. So, yes, and let me say a few words on findings. First, it's very difficult to make some generalizations across rural Europe and across any region in general. So instead of looking for some common trends, we need to study the so-called actually existing populism that takes on different forms depending on the context-specific factors such as history, culture, socioeconomic structures, and so on. And our special issue papers demonstrate this. Second thing I would like to say is that despite the different manifestations of right-wing populism in Europe, the cause of the crisis is pretty much the same everywhere. It is the fundamental crisis of neoliberal globalized capitalism that hit rural areas the hardest. And populists present themselves as the true protectors of ordinary people. But in fact, when they come to power, they rarely keep their promises. And we have different examples of this from both Eastern and Western Europe. And the third point, what I'd like to say today is the somewhat different language spoken by the progressive movements and the conservative villagers. And that's a challenge of building sustainable alternatives. Rural social movements for food sovereignty are doing a great job in rural Europe, and they're getting stronger every day, and that we witnessed in our papers as well. But they face difficulties in mobilizing large sections of the rural population. Many villagers in Europe, they remain being conservative, and they are concerned with bread and butter issues rather than abstract ideas of food sovereignty. So it's important for the movements to be able to reach out to these groups as well and talk about their concerns. And hopefully we as a scholar activists can help them with this. Follow us on Facebook. We have Facebook group ERPI Europe that focused on European region, almost 900 members. We organize workshops and participate in conferences. And currently we are working towards a workshop in Zagreb in September. So join us to get our news and updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Immediately, I will hand over to Boaventura Monjane, who will also provide a regional update. Boa.
Thank you, Ruth. Hi, everyone. I'm Boaventura Monjane. I'm a postdoc fellow at PLUS and also a fellow of the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter Strategies of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I speak on behalf of ERPI Africa, not so much to provide an analysis of the evolution of authoritarianism and populism on the continent, but rather to share what we have done and what we intended to do this year and beyond as ERPI Africa. However, let me briefly touch on some of the developments we are seeing in Africa. These may not be happening everywhere on the continent or at the same time, but we believe that the authoritarian moment is manifesting itself in different ways in Africa. We have seen the rise of ethnic and racial chauvinism. This probably more evident in South Africa, but not only there. We also have seen an ever increasing rise of religious, conservative, evangelical movements that sell prosperity and depoliticize social problems and challenges. This has fallen on fertile ground on the continent in the absence of progressive politics. Therefore, prosperity cults turning issues of life and dignity a gamble on faith rather than and deflecting from structural factors. Furthermore, states have repositioned themselves by adopting and promoting neoliberalism, engaging in state paternalism, and allying with corporations and agrarian capital, often in advance of or in combination with institutional adjustments against the rural and urban poor. We also observed the rise of rapid financialization and fast-track extractivism, which leads to conflicts over land and natural resources. There are also insurgent movements in regions rendered unstable by resource conflicts, for instance, oil and gas booms, combined with long-term development failures under neoliberalism. This is the case in Mozambique, Mali, Sudan, the Republic Democratic of Congo, and elsewhere. To understand these developments and strategize on how to counter them, we are relaunching the process and networking with other critical scholars and activists who are grappling with the same issues of the new exclusionary politics that lead to inequalities and social division. We believe that Pan-Africanism is a central concept in an emancipatory response against, for instance, narrow nationalisms and xenophobia. Plus, in particular, Professor Ruth Hall and myself have led the process for moving forward and have begun discussions with networks such as Codergia, the Samoyo African Institute for Agrarian Studies, the Center for African Studies at the University of Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique, and the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. We also highlighted the partnership with we are building with the Collective for African Renewal, CORA, a dynamic emerging space where some of these conversations of exclusionary politics and emancipatory alternatives are taking root. We intend to engage other national and regional networks, research institutions, social movements, and trade unions on the continent. The vision is a more interconnected network of institutions and movements, rural and urban, around theories and practices of emancipatory politics. This is to set in motion a process that we believe will bear fruit in this year and beyond through a number of proposals, for instance, a small grant program for researchers and activists, a conference or some culminating event, a virtual community, publishing academic outputs, most probably culminating in a special issue in the review of African political economy, which its editorial working group has already found exciting. And also the production, I'm concluding, the production of popular materials. And here our Agrarian Politics podcast is a case. We hope to inspire and encourage other regions of the world to work with us, to find ways to confront authoritarianism and populism in its various forms, and to inspire the emergence of emancipatory politics and counter strategies in Africa and globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Boa. And finally, I'm going to ask Ahmad Shah to give us a quick update as well about initiatives taken and the plans going forward. Ahmad, can you introduce yourself and give us the update?
Thank you very much, Ruth. Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmad. I am a PhD researcher at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands, and also a member of the ERPI Asian collectives. I think what we see in Asia in the last 4 years since the passage of the ERPI conference in 2018 are also similar trends of the further consolidation of authoritarian and populist forms of politics. Two things that maybe we'd like to point out. One was that we've really seen very clearly that authoritarian regimes across the Asian region have used this opportunity of the COVID pandemic to consolidate their power. There was a very severe crackdown on political opposition and civil society across almost all countries. Some of it was reported, for instance, in regions of India and China, in Thailand, but we've also seen similar trends happening pretty much in almost every country in the Asian region. Another important recent demonstration of these dynamics of authoritarian populist politics was the coup in Myanmar last year and the subsequent large-scale violence by the military junta against mass civil disobedience movements which are seeking the restoration of democracy. For us in the ERPI, we really understand these developments as being closely linked to broader processes of restructuring, specifically around contemporary global agrarian capitalism, and also the accelerating demand for rural land and resources globally. For us, rural parts of Asia are very much a crucial space for consolidation and for contestation of these trends towards authoritarian populism that we are seeing. However, the precise ways these broader trends actually work out really play out very differently from country to country. We don't have time to discuss that in detail here. But we do see a key focus for us is to really understand the specificities across countries, but then also compared to what is happening in other regions. One thing that we think is also important to mention is the crucial role of strong and often very long-running forms of cultural and religious nationalism, which has been a common thread across the rise of authoritarian and populist forms of politics across the Asian region. And this is also something that Achin referred to earlier in his presentation. Within the ERPI Asian grouping, we have been engaging with these developments in diverse ways. We met in a number of informal interactions and workshops to discuss perspectives from different countries and to share the experiences of different countries. There were small workshops in Chiang Mai for the Southeast Asian cluster in 2018, and in Jaffna in Sri Lanka in 2019 for the South Asian cluster. More recently, some ERPI participants have been involved in an online conference which focused on agrarian disruptions and emancipatory politics in South Asia. And at present, work is ongoing to consolidate some of these discussions for a special issue of the magazine Jamhur. A key focus for us in these regional discussions has been to collectively come together and build a more comparative understanding. So to really understand these diverse forms of authoritarianism and populism across Asia, but then to also relate them to the particular rural context that we find ourselves in, and then to see the similarities and differences. We are very happy for others to join us in these discussions. I'll share the links to the ERPI South Asia and the broader collective. So please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. Thanks for that update. And thanks to everyone for the really great questions which have been shared in the Q&A box. I am glad to say, have nearly 20 minutes left to have a nice question and answer discussion. So I'd like to, I see we got kind of one set of questions which really dig deeper into some of the causes, the origins, and the drivers of authoritarian populism. It becomes a mouthful. And then we have a second set of questions that deals with emancipatory alternatives. So I'd like to break those into two rounds if I can, and I will ask a few questions first on the deepening the causes, deepening analysis of the causes, which I will then go to each of the speakers to respond to briefly. And I'd ask you to try to keep your responses to just 1 to 2 minutes. And then I hope that we can have a second round to go around and offer some thoughts and reflections on the possible alternatives and emancipatory futures that we see. So I will read out 3 questions now, and then we will go around in the same order as initially. So I'm afraid, Achin, you will be on the spot off the ball. So yeah, we received several interesting questions here. The first one from an anonymous commentator is directed to Achin, but I would invite any of these speakers also to weigh in with their thoughts. And he or she asked, would it be appropriate or not, and why, to conclude that the political economy of the authoritarian nationalism is always capitalist, regardless of its ideology, whether left-wing or right-wing of that particular nationalism? So deepening a little bit on the question of what is the political economy of authoritarian nationalism, and how does this relate to the ideology, as Achin was discussing. I should say for the speakers, you're welcome to dig into one of these questions or all 3 if you feel you can, but in the name of brevity, you might pick your favorite. We have a second question from Adam Jadav, who says, I would like to hear any thoughts about the potential scope for explicit anti-nationalism, noting again Achin's comment on authoritarian populism as fundamentally the same as authoritarian nationalism. And Adam notes, beyond this audience, the nation qua nation too often is treated as a given, limiting transnational visions. And we talk much of peasants within countries and of movements within nations. It seems that some strains of indigenous radical politics might point to a different way forward, but those conversations are sometimes backgrounded in agrarian discussions focused on neoliberalism. So in sum, where and how can critical agrarians radically advance a truly anti-national politics? And why is this so difficult? And I would be interested to hear speakers' responses on all of those points. And then lastly, again, addressed in this case specifically to Garrett, but again, open to anyone who would like to weigh in. Another anonymous questioner has asked, in your talk, you analyze how authoritarian populism is affecting Black people, women's rights, peasant communities. What are your thoughts about how gender identity politics are reinforcing or promoting authoritarian politics and the relationships between those different forms of politics. So I would be, I would like to hand over now to Achin, and then we will go around to all of the speakers.
Okay, let me just take the first two questions. The first question was about, I think it brought in Hitler's Germany and also socialist countries. Let me just say one thing here. About Hitler's Germany, he talked about socialism, but that was because the vast majority of the working population were socialists at that time, and he had to defeat it. And obviously Hitler's Germany was a capitalist country. However, countries like Stalin's Russia, one party China, etc., are also deeply authoritarian. And they're authoritarian nationalists. But there, the point is that you have to distinguish between an authoritarian populism from above. All authoritarian governments want to make themselves popular below, but have difficulty doing so and use a combination of carrots and sticks. So Stalin's Russia was, of course, okay, you will improve your standard of living, you keep quiet about the absence of democracy. The only time when it became authoritarian populist was when Hitler attacked them. Again, the question of nationalism comes in there. However, the real problem today about different kinds of authoritarian populisms is that the authoritarian populism which are getting support from below are much more dangerous. India, Brazil, Philippines, to some extent France. This is much more worrying and much more difficult than simply authoritarian governments always trying to make themselves popular from above. And the reason why we talk about capitalist countries is forget, nobody wants that kind of socialism anymore. We have to get rid of this capitalism, but be a much more democratic socialism. And today we're talking about capitalist countries. That's why we're talking about neoliberalism and all that except here. Around the second question with regard to the question of nationalism and internationalism, right? In one sentence, there are limits to how progressive nationalism can be. There are no limits to how reactionary nationalism can be. Which means that we have to fight on the international level. We cannot resolve environmental, nuclear questions, even poverty questions on the national level. But the only way to get there is by succeeding at the national level first, and then connecting with others. And here, a country, a small country which succeeds in having a progressive social democratic left wing moving towards socialism government will have a ripple effect. But the bigger the country or the more advanced that country, the ripple effect will be even bigger. So yes, we have to connect and we have to try, but let us not forget that we have to work within our own countries. And that means uniting urban and rural, connecting to the working class and other sections of society here, and pushing it in a much more anti-capitalist direction. That is your first necessary but not sufficient step.
Thank you very much, Achin, and already drifting towards the last part of the conversation, a little bit opening the door towards a discussion of our strategies and the future possibilities. Can I go now to Ramona?
Thank you so much. I've been looking at the questions. There are so many big questions, very, very smart, very sophisticated questions. And thank you so much for them. I will try to clarify a few things that perhaps respond to many of them. For us, the people who live in rural areas, who produce food, it's really clear what populism is about and what authoritarianism is about. It essentially turns the poor people, the poor social classes against each other to achieve power and money and so on, without giving anything to these people, trying to hold them captive in a system that only benefits the rich. We can feel it in our bones. We are living it day by day. So we don't need, maybe we're not very good at elaborating it in a very intellectual way, but we do understand what it means, where it comes from, what tools it uses, and how, and we are certainly cautious about it, and we try to fight it back every day. In terms of how we use different words, food sovereignty, nationalism, self-determination, it's really complicated because these concepts are very difficult to use at national level, at local level. We are working globally as La Via Campesina on building food sovereignty. We're extremely proud, and we have to reaffirm every time what food sovereignty is really about, because there is a lot of wrongful appropriation, especially by political parties. But it's really difficult to use them, because countries are afraid of concepts like this, because they tend to believe that these kind of freedoms attempt to the sovereignty of the state and the role of the state and so on. But we in reality are the best and the biggest partner of our countries, and we believe in public institutions, unlike the private sector, the rich private sector that is trying to undermine the role of the states and to replace it, basically. So there is a fear of using a cautious way of using food sovereignty. We're using it cautiously in Romania as well. You see extreme right groups who speak about food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, military sovereignty, especially nowadays that conflicts are building more and more. So we are trying to use more the essence of what food sovereignty is, and our work is more rooted in the work we do, working the land, producing food. We do a lot of work on building our seed sovereignty, where women are at the center. So there is a tremendous feminist approach to our work. We're working on building peasant rights in the national legislation, which is really complicated, but which is slowly advancing. We're working against land grabbing and access to land for young people and for smallholders. But unfortunately, our work is also focused a lot on resistance. We're on a defensive mode a lot. We are resisting against the corporate agenda, who have tremendous tools, enormous resources, public resources most of the time. So yeah, the work is not as spectacular, or it doesn't have a very accelerated pace as much as we would like to. And when we analyze the rural people and the faults of the rural people, why we are not progressive enough, it's really important how we do it. As you are smart people, academics, scholars, it's really important that when we go to rural areas, we don't directly confront the rural people with very progressive concepts that were developed by urban people, like I don't know, on gender equality and things like that. There is a lot of solidarity in rural area, a lot of cooperation. There are a lot of minorities living together. We should see how this is happening in reality, and instead of having this confrontation of ideas, quite inappropriate at times. It's actually our experience, and really I'm sorry, I don't want to be too long, but I'll stop here then.
And we hope still to have time for one more concluding comment, but just to make sure, and I will pass on now to Garrett. Thank you very much.
Sure. I just want to thank the panelists. I've learned so much and it's so inspiring. And this feels so crucial just to be connecting right now and hearing what's happening all over the world, from South Africa to Romania to India. So thank you for the organizers. Thank you for these extraordinary questions. The fact that they're getting asked and talked about and answered, I feel like is part of the work. I'll just quickly say hyper-nationalism is toxic patriarchy, is heteropatriarchy, is the misogyny. So the intersection of racial agrocapitalism and misogyny, and particularly heterosexist misogyny, is the work of addressing that. Cannot be done without addressing the dominance of the nation state as the national scale, as the dominant scale of reference. So I feel like the questions about gender intersect with the questions about the oppressive hegemony of the nation state as a dominant scale of reference in our political institutions and even in our organizing and in our kind of geopolitical imaginaries. So the work of dismantling the nation state as our chief referent as we do this transnational organizing is key from a feminist and a queer feminist and anti-racist perspective and an abolitionist perspective. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Garrett. And I will pass now to Ayala, who will speak once again in Portuguese. So please, everybody, if you wish to listen in English, just adjust your interpretation.
So I'll try to quickly say what I was planning to say as my last thought. So as a peasant organization fighting for the land, if you see all the challenges in a country like ours, there are many challenges for peasants and others. You see this in Brazil and around the world, in fact. Right now, we are living through a moment where the neoliberal conservative agenda is pushing forwards. We know the names, we know the faces, we know where these people live, so to speak. So it's the market, it's transnational companies, agribusiness, the churches, conservative evangelical churches. These people have been pushing back our rights. They've been pushing back against defense of the environment. They have directly affected the lives of women and Black people. Sadly, in Brazil at least, in this context, we've seen heightened violence against women at home as well, and against the Black population. So the police have been doing it. It's been legitimized by the discourse of the president even. The MST is fighting for land and agrarian reform. In this context, it's hard. So if we think about class, we can try and put together the right conditions to get back to our specific banners. So access to land and agrarian reform. That's the big framework for our mobilizations, as we call them. It goes beyond our specific issues as rural dwellers. We need control of land and the resources linked to the land. So the contradictions of the current system have been worsened by the pandemic. As peasants, we want agency. We want to keep ourselves healthy, and that's no small ask in this context. And we need to really pay attention. We need to show solidarity with women living in urban areas. They are suffering in this context of the pandemic. Over the last 2 years, we've had to take on this task. We have been showing solidarity with people going hungry. 19 million Brazilians are currently experiencing hunger. They don't have enough to eat. We need solidarity with all these millions who are suffering from hunger. We are donating food that we produce in our territories. We are producing food for these people. We are proud that today that we've given more than 6 million tons of food. A large quantity of food has been donated. We've shown solidarity with the people who need to live in dignity. This is what we've done in our territories, in our spaces, the spaces where we plant, sometimes in semi-urban areas. So through the land and working on the land, we can reap the benefits of a society that we want. So people are physically in a position to face this economic model. It's going to take us a long time. That's what I was hoping to say. We are agents. If we're going to overcome capitalism and those contradictions, we need to take action. We need to think about a collective action, defending nature, democratization of rights, promoting practices and values that do not follow the logic of capital. These are various there are aspects to consider. That's what we're trying to do. This type of seminar helps to promote these hidden, camouflaged initiatives. These are concrete expressions of the other world that is possible. This is what I wanted to say before, and I didn't have time to say.
Thank you so much, Ayala. Thank you so much for that. And everyone for their really rich responses. As I think you can see, I'm afraid we are officially out of our time, but if our interpreters and our speakers would bear with us, I would really love to give everyone the chance to say just a few closing words. We received some very rich questions on emancipatory futures, on the possibilities of rural and urban solidarity, of communitarian and degrowth alternatives, and of course, on the possibilities of the food sovereignty movement. I will not have time to read those all out, but I wonder if I could ask each of you in just a few sentences, maximum 1 minute, to say what you think is the really critical message about the future of emancipatory politics, and if you see one concrete action beyond this discussion that you would like to encourage people to take away with them, we would love to hear that. I'll go around for simplicity in the same order again, if that's all right. So, and just keeping really to 1 minute so we can let our interpreters go nearly on time. So Achin?
Right, I'll just say something about what lessons can be taken from the remarkable Indian farmers movement. Number one, this was led not by big farmers, but by small and middle farmers, who also had the support of landless laborers, because they recognized the importance. One of the biggest reasons for their support from landless laborers and for the success was that the biggest organizations that led this struggle, there were a number of such organizations, but among the biggest were far left, Marxist left organizations. That's something. Third, this was not a strike. Very important. This was a massive occupation for months by tens of thousands of people. What does this mean? It means that they had the capacity to sustain it while carrying on with their farming and other activities because of the backward linkages between those who were sit-ins and those back home in the villages, who all cooperated each other. And they had, if you like, processes of rotation in terms of the people going back for 1 week, coming back after 1 week, women coming there, the grandparents coming in, and they all carried on like that. So this was an example, if you like, of how a mass occupation, but it varies from country to country. In India, you're dealing with over 50% which are in the rural hinterland and in small towns and connected. In advanced countries, it's much smaller, and the responsibility of linking up with the urban areas and other becomes even much greater. That was also important in the Indian case, but I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Achin. Thank you. Ramona?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to reassure all of you and even myself that peasants are here to stay. We've been here since always. We're going to continue to work. We have to be constant and consistent in our work to pursue food sovereignty and the realization of peasant rights. We can see the limitations and the faults of authoritarianism and the ideologies that flirt with authoritarianism. There will come a time when they're going to fall, and we need to be there strong, proposing our project that will elevate human rights in the rural society, because the world needs rural societies to be better. Everyone will benefit if peasants' rights are realized and recognized and respected. So for this work, we need more people. We need by our side scholars and academics. And we believe in your role. It's really important. It can help us transmit the message to decision makers, to the whole society, and we need more. We are hoping this is just the beginning. We have been cooperating already for a long time, but yeah, it seems that this terrible crisis we're experiencing is setting us a little bit back, but we are more determined than ever that our peasant way is the best way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. Thanks very much. And I'll pass now to Garrett, reminding us that although I am asking you all to speak very briefly, I would ask you also to still contradictorily try to speak slowly.
Yes, I'll just echo what Professor Asheen and what Ramona just heroically reminded us, that these broader structures of empire and capitalism will ultimately fall. They're ultimately so precarious and so full of contradictions. And so as they crumble, it will be hard, but these peasant-led, campesino-led movements are the way forward for collective survival. So it's an honor to be in deep solidarity and collaboration with all of you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Garrett. And for the closing word, I would like to hand back to Ayala.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's great to share this bit of poetry with you. It means so much for us in the MST in Brazil. We are building a reality that still does not exist. We are part of a pedagogical adventure. This is our journey. We are small, but we have big dreams. Thank you very much, and I'll see you at the next, when we have an opportunity. Thank you.
Well, I'm very sorry that this is all we have time for. It seems like we have very practical, short-term priorities as well as long-term vision, ideas around solidarity, mass occupations, confronting authoritarian populism while building alternatives, building links between rural and urban movements, the roles of scholar activists. So a number of important processes. And I think that what we've also heard, thank you to Natalia, Boa, and Ahmad, that there are regional processes that are linking up as well as these global conversations. Thank you to all our guests and to everyone for participating in this discussion. A reminder that this Agrarian Conversations webinar series is a collaboration. There is now a website in English only so far, where resources and events are shared. We would also like to now share contact details for who you can contact with ideas or proposals for next events, for processes and opportunities to bring us together. We will also be sharing in a moment a poll where you can vote for what you would like to see as the next topics for this series of conversations. On your screen, you should see a poll. Do you want to talk in the future about land-ocean interfaces and the rise of aquaculture, or COVID and the politics of transnational migrant labor, or mining, energy, and non-agrarian rural landscapes, or urban dimensions of critical agrarian studies, or the global Green New Deal, or land, climate, and the politics of net zero? So with that, please, could you submit your vote in the poll? And in closing, I want to thank the whole team at the Transnational Institute for their amazing organizational support. Also, putting these events together costs money, particularly for interpretation, to keep this inclusive. Thank you to our interpreters. If you have appreciated this event, please consider making a donation, if you can, to any of our organizations, maybe particularly TNI that carries this. But thank you everyone for joining us. This is an ongoing conversation. There will be all the links that were shared today will be shared in a follow-up email. We leave the chat open for a few minutes so that we can wrap up conversations, and please make sure that you complete the poll. And with that, thank you for joining us for this urgent, important conversation. It takes us forward, but there will be many more such conversations as we tread this path of confronting authoritarian populism and building alternatives. Thank you to our wonderful speakers and to our hosts, TNI. And thank you everyone for staying on. Thank you.